Chancellor White, welcome to 13 Action News. Thanks for coming on the program.
It's my pleasure to be here.
So let's talk about where the system is at now. You took over after a lot of controversy surrounding Dan Clays just a few months ago. And now there's all this talk about changing the structure of what the chancellor does. The Las Vegas Sun had an editorial today. There was talk among some of the regents about forming committees to oversee the universities as opposed to having the chancellor oversee them. What is going on?
Sure. So obviously the system, the board are all in a bit of a bad way in their reputation with the public, with the legislators. This is a time for the system to be introspective. They haven't really reviewed what they've done in over a decade. And I think it's fair to say that we've had two unconventional chancellors in a row, and that has probably evolved the way that the system operates to a great extent. So some of it is really asking this question about how the system operates, where it goes. I would say, though, that there's not a lot of room for adjusting the system under the current constitutional structure. In the parlance of higher education, there are coordinating boards, which are usually very spare and focus only on policy, and then there are governing boards that focus on how the institutions operate. By Constitution, this board is both. And so the nature of the system under that, I think, has not been very clear, and we're working with the regents to try and make clearer what kind of chancellor they want, because they're about to do a search, and what kind of system that chancellor will lead and how they interact with the institutions.
I think most people are watching this, just they want, as I have, I've lived here for more than 30 years, you want to have a high quality system of higher education. You want quality universities, you want quality community college system. And so people are kind of wondering, you know, I don't think people want to see an overreaction to what happened. And I think, as you put it, with the last two unconventional chancellors, there is this anomaly of the higher education system seeming to be like a separate branch of government because of the Constitution. The question is, what does the system need to operate most efficiently to deliver a high quality of education to be better than it has been?
Yeah, well, I think they have to be funded better, but I'll come back to that.
I think that's always been the seminal question. I agree with you. Go on.
I think there's quite a lot of diversity in how higher education is organized. The structure matters to some degree, but every state does it a little bit differently, and there are at least a dozen models among the 50 states that you could identify. And indeed, there's some states like California that have multiple systems.
Right.
So the system structure, which we've had since 1969, matters to some degree, but what really matters is how the institutions relate to the board, how the system itself helps to facilitate that relationship. The trend these days is to treat the presidents of the institutions as CEOs, to give them greater autonomy. And I think the board was already leaning in that direction to a great extent. But with any deliberative body of 13 members, there's probably not unanimity in doing so. Though last week the board did devolve to the president's power over appointing ADs and athletics coaches, and I think that's a sign of the direction the board is leaning today.
But that makes sense, I would think.
Well, sure.
Right? You know, to have you shouldn't have to have the athletic directors or the coaches come before the board of regents. Correct. That doesn't make much sense. But it does seem to make much sense, just to play devil's advocate here. I don't know if I'm playing devil's advocate. Maybe you'll agree with me. To have the chancellor be the person who is the boss of the university presidents, which essentially is how it has worked in the past. Otherwise, what is the chancellor's job? What are you going to just sit in the higher ed office and push paper all day? What's the chancellor's job, right?
Well, the chancellor's job for sure is being a leader of the higher education system. To go back to the distinction between functions, the chancellor surely is engaged in this coordinative role. What is this role of this institution versus that institution? How do we deal with the various attributes of the state's demography? How do we respond to the policy issues in the state? In the governance context, the chancellor's role is a little more ambiguous, but he is, as you suggest, the boss of the presidents. And I think that's crucial because otherwise the presidents would have 13 bosses. And so identifying that role, which I think at our retreat a couple of weeks ago, the presidents were very clear. They want a strong chancellor who has academic experience, preferably someone who's run an institution before, or maybe even a system. And they think that that's necessary in order to be able to be effective. The presidents are under tremendous pressure to produce. The nature of higher education has created a huge problem for institutions. and they need a chancellor to assist them and to assist the board in being focused on what the higher education system needs.
So what's being considered now? You mentioned, it doesn't make much sense to me to have the president's report to 13 bosses, as you mentioned, the regions. There's also these talk, and correct me if I'm wrong, sir, of some committees overseeing each one. Why? What is the argument against the chancellor doing what a chancellor generally does, which is oversee each of these institutions?
I don't know that there's much of an argument against that. I think there have been some concerns about chancellors being too involved.
Micromanaging,
but I think more important perhaps as the system administration takes on new roles, a notion about whether those roles are appropriate. I think part of the challenge is that from the board perspective, the coordination functions that boards have grown dramatically. They've gotten more things to focus on that 20 years ago nobody really cared about student progression and completion as a state policy matter. Now we do care about it, and the board wants the system to be focused on it. Well, that puts the system in the position of talking to the campuses and saying, this is what you ought to be doing. And that incremental growth, I think, has raised some issues. On the other side, institutions themselves are under tremendous pressure, and the governance role of the board has grown. So in between that, the system has been asked to do a lot more, and I don't think that we've done that in a systematic way. I think we've sort of grown in that direction bit by bit without really thinking it through strategically.
I guess what I'm wondering is, you had this controversy over CLH and transparency and relationship with the legislators, and I guess what I'm wondering is, you as the acting chancellor now, you said when you took the job, listen, my first job is to reach out to lawmakers to repair maybe some bridges that had been burned or at least were crumbling, and to get back at what the real issue there was, sir, which is the funding formula and more money going to the right places. How is that going?
Well, it was going very well. We paused a little bit because the board wanted to talk about structure. Now that they've had that conversation, they chose not to make any dramatic changes, though I wouldn't say they've closed the door on that conversation. So now we're going to restart it. Just last week, I gave a talk about the state of higher education to the board. I plan to reprise that talk for pretty much anyone who wants to listen. And I think the takeaways are, we don't have enough there. We don't have enough students enrolled. We're not invested heavily enough. And yet at the same time, while our institutions haven't performed as well as we need them to, they've been improving since the new funding formula has been adopted. Now granted, this is going to be a very difficult legislative session, not just because we have to repair our relationship with legislators, but also because there's not any money. And so as a consequence, I think we'll need to focus on how incrementally to build support for new initiatives in higher education to increase our enrollment levels, to try and work away on attainment of for Nevada citizens.
What's the root cause? Why are the enrollment levels lower than they should be?
Well, I think it's a couple of things. When we grew really rapidly, we tended to add people who are already past their college-going years. And right now, we have a smaller number of children coming through the system that will be college students in years to come. But even then, with a smaller core of 18 to 25-year-olds, we only have about a quarter enrolled in higher education, whereas the U.S. average is about 40%. We really have to build a college-going culture, but also there's some pipeline issues. Students aren't graduating high school at a high enough level, and as well, they're not necessarily as prepared as they need to be, so a higher chance that they're going to drop out when they do enroll.
Those percentages have been bad over the years of remedial education being needed once kids get into college, and that affects obviously the quality of the entire institution, or how they're judged from afar, right?
Sure. Well, these are very difficult tasks, and we're asking our institutions to do it with less money than some of their peer institutions. So the challenge for us is this circle of being underinvested on the one hand and having a difficult pipeline issue on the other. If we're going to get the number of Nevadans with advanced degrees up, we really have to come up with a strategy for investing more. And I think substantively that's the key question going into this legislative session and those in the future.
Which is more funding, essentially. I mean, you've
Correct.
heard the governor, at least when I talked to the governor about what his goals are
Yeah.
coming into the 2017 session. This is a while ago now.
Yeah.
He kind of thought of the 2015 session with this landmark lower education program that was
Yeah.
passed. That 2017, and you should be happy to hear this, is going to be a session where higher education becomes a focus. You know, it often isn't with governors and legislators
Right.
because there's not as natural a constituency, right?
Yeah.
But no great state, no great cities don't have great higher education institutions. I think you probably agree with that. How do we get there? Is it just about funding? Is it about better targeting of funding? What's the
Sure.
answer?
Well, we've taken the first step. The funding formula, though there are things that we might want to tinker with in it, has focused our institutions on increasing enrollment, increasing progression, increasing degree attainment. The problem is we don't have enough people in the system now, and that means working with secondary ed, working through our community colleges, and really just focusing on growing the capacity to do that. Obviously, we need funding, but we'll need targeted funding. So what I've asked, per my speech last week, is that the legislature revisit the 2004 study that they did about capacity in higher education for Nevada. That was a very good study, but of course it's over 10 years ago since they've
Right.
done it, and this is a different universe in Nevada than it was in 2004. So I'd like to see the legislature do that. I think it would be a very helpful study and point the way for sort of ways for us to be able to chip away at this project without a huge sum of money, though in the end, a greater investment in higher education is unavoidable.
What about the integration between the university system and this drive by the governor and others for economic diversification, which has been talked a lot about in
Yeah.
recent years, much more than
Correct.
in the past? How essential is that, do you think?
It's crucial. I mean, we have a limited amount of revenue to be able to dedicate to the many state obligations. Higher education is unprotected, so it ends up, as in many states, being the entity that is least capable of receiving new funds. So if we're going to make investments, those investments need to be aligned with the state's goals. The good thing is that those goals are consistent with the goals of the higher education system and most of our institutions. We're really looking on improved student success on the one hand, closing the equity gap for our diverse population, and increasing workforce and economic development, which includes improving our research capacity at our research institutions.
When I first moved here more than 30 years ago, nobody talked about academics at the university system here, right? It was all about sports.
Sure.
And now I'm hearing talk, and it's surfaced over the last few years, about bringing both of these universities into so-called Tier 1 status,
Sure.
right? It's going to take a while, perhaps. Is that a realistic goal, and if so, why?
Well, it's a realistic goal because everyone realizes that having a robust research institution helps with economic development, it helps with research commercialization, and it also helps to create that spark in the community so that a student with a cute idea doesn't feel like he's got to go somewhere else to be able to explore it. It is a process of building institutional capacity, and that's going to take a while. What we have, though, is an institution in UNLV, for example, that has transformed dramatically. I mean, remember that it gave its first PhD only in the early 90s. So really, in a short period of time, has gone from a master's granting regional institution to Carnegie Research 2. And so it shows that in a short period of time, you can make these transformations, and both of the institutions, UNLV and UNR, need to do so. But they'll really need targeted investments to be able to pull it off.
Do you get a sense from going and talking to people out there in the community, Chancellor, that the culture that exists now in Nevada really cares about higher education? Because maybe I was too cynical about this, but for many years, I've just not seen it.
Yeah.
Do you feel that there's enough people out there who care about what you're talking about, changing the funding, making it a more diverse state, all of these things? Does it exist more now than before, do you think?
I think since the recession, absolutely. But I think also because we've had some successes with the law school, the dental school, it has shown that we're capable of building very strong institutions if we're committed to it. What I don't think people have confronted yet is, A, the size of the gap, the nature of the investment that's needed. The gap between our institutions as they stand today and the kinds of institutions that they have in mind for the city and for the state.
Long way to go, you mean?
I think there's a long way to go, but I don't think that the detail of that distance is very clear to folk. And there's a little bit of a risk as you explain it to them that they'll become cynical about it and say, well, we can't get there. But I think, in fact, there is a well-worn path to getting there for these institutions, and many states have followed it. It really is one that we have to undertake and do so in an organized and planned way.
Does the path look so long because there's so much money involved, or is there something else to turn this battleship around? What do you need to do?
Well, it's a combination of things. It is the culture within the institutions. It is the balance between the institution's functions in student attainment, in community service, and in research, and you really have to keep that balance together, otherwise you end up with a distorted institution. And it's the investments that allow you to build on it by doing more research. If you think about it, most institutions that are high-level research institutions get 40 to 60% overhead payments from the federal government. So they get grants, they can dedicate the rest of that to the rest of their institution, presumably in building research infrastructure. So you have an institution with $500 million that they spend every year. About $250,000 of that, probably a little bit less, is able to be dedicated to building the infrastructure of the institution. When our institutions are much lower than that, they have a smaller bit that they can rededicate. So for a period of time, we're really going to have to focus on building the infrastructure, building the capacity to be able to be a productive research institution, both in the North and in the South.
A couple other quick subjects. I mentioned sports. There's been all this talk, and it seems to be overwhelming everything else about this stadium that may come, and there's talk about the Raiders, but UNLV has been mentioned as well. I'm not sure whether UNLV has been used, I hate to use the word here, but I will, as a patsy by the Raiders and by the Sands, and so much focus on this. Does it mean a lot to an institution? And if so, to get where I know you want to go, where I'd like to see it go, to build a stadium for football?
Well, the stadium itself is a part of a whole host of things that go to the campus culture. So one of the things that's happening in higher education right now is that many institutions are focusing on getting big, mostly through recruiting non-resident students. The best example of that is apropos of your question. Alabama's gone from about 15,000 students to 40 in just over 10 years. They are selling the campus atmosphere, and frankly, they're selling national championship football.
They've won a few of those.
I'm not suggesting that you need to build a national championship football and all the investments that are related to that, but it is very clear, even for urban campuses, that a campus atmosphere is crucial to student success, it's crucial to student recruitment, and there's some examples that work. Cincinnati is a good one, probably also Louisville, places that have focused on shedding the commuter image, even as they remain largely commuter campuses, in large part because it creates a connectivity to students and helps them to be more invested in completing their studies. So if a stadium can help with that, that's a positive, though I think this particular stadium project, subject as it is to its own organizational entity, is something that we don't have much control over. We'll watch how it develops, and hopefully it'll be an asset that UNLV can benefit from.
Final question. You've had a distinguished career here. You're dean of a very great young law school. You're provost at UNLV. Now you're acting chancellor. You want the permanent job?
No, this is a position I took knowing that I wouldn't be a candidate. I think it helps me to be able to do the job this cycle, not being a candidate and not having that swirling around. I made a different decision when the UNLV presidency opened because I thought it would make it more capable of me being able to do the job in that space.
You applied for that job in case people don't know.
I did. But as provost, I think being an applicant helped me to be successful in a space of ambiguity with the rapid departure of our prior president. I'm looking forward to going back to the faculty. I had a course ready to go when I got asked to do this, and so I haven't been in the classroom for about 5 years now, and be excited to do that once I've done this.
Nothing wrong with being a law school professor, right?
It's a very good job.
All right. Chancellor, I really appreciate your willingness to come on and talk about these issues. Thanks.
Thank you for having me.
All right.
Okay.
We good?